So I just wanted to take a second to do just some reflection on the second part of our reading, books 5 to 8, and just 10 takeaways from these curious chapters. I'm with my cat, Camille, here. Camille, say hello. Say hello. All right. Camille loves the classics. So she wasn't up here. I'm in my loft. She wasn't up here. And then I started doing some tinkering with the poem, and she immediately sat on my lap. So she might have something to say along the way. So just 10 takeaways. These are things that some of them my students might bring up after these chapters, and some after they get a chance to raise their questions and concerns. Some of these are just some insights I might bring up. And this is limited. It goes way beyond this. These are just sort of maybe the obvious ones. So I think the first thing, going sort of chronologically, books 5 to 8, involves Calypso's character. When we meet Odysseus in the first line of the poem, or we hear of him, we don't meet him literally, he's referred to as polytropos, many-sided, or as Emily Wilson calls him, complicated. But I think it's really important with texts like this that have such a prominent main character to be mindful that it's not a one-man play. There are many complicated characters, and Calypso is definitely one of them. One could look at her as, we can debate whether she's good or evil. To me, one of the most interesting interactions in the entire epic is when Hermes, the messenger god, comes to tell her that it's been fated, it's been willed by Zeus also, that Odysseus must return home. She isn't immediately pious. She doesn't immediately do the will of the head god. She gives a very legitimate complaint that male gods can have dalliances and sexual affairs with female mortals, sort of without compunction, but here a female god loves a mortal man and isn't allowed to keep him. Odysseus has been on the island with her for 7 whole years. And the question of whether she loves Odysseus, I think, is a really good point of a good conversation point. It might be the case that Odysseus loves his wife and wants to return to her, and at the same time, this goddess also loves him. He is, for I think a lot of reasons, appealing to lots of different female characters. I think he's really appealing, obviously, to his wife, who misses him. There's something about Helena Troy when she talks about him, or Helen of Sparta, when she talks about him, she seems to have affection for him. Athena has affection for him. Calypso has affection for him. Other characters we'll meet later do. And I know some people refer to Odysseus as Calypso's sex slave. I don't know. I get the sense that it's more complicated than that. I think a really good conversation is connected to another point I'll make later, is why Odysseus is crying. And it might have to do with the fact that some piece of him, I know he says he misses his homeland, but one wonders whether something he can't say out loud, that he actually has affections for someone else. So she's not a stick figure, one-dimensional character. And I'm still wrestling with Calypso as a character, but she's definitely worth exploring. Secondly, why, when we meet the hero of the epic and the character whose brilliant choice essentially ended the Trojan War, why, when we meet him all the way in book 5, is he crying? So we know he's crying on the beach. I've already read this passage out loud in the previous presentation. And his immediate response when Calypso approaches him and tells him that she will free him, his immediate response is paranoia. He's been in battle for 10 years and with her for 7. And he does not trust her. So he's weeping. And again, I think it's really worth having a conversation as to where those tears come from. I think the starting point is the text, right? The starting point is what he literally says. But if we know anything about Odysseus, he very rarely tells the whole story. He either tells an outright lie or a slanted version of a story that benefits him in the moment. So this is worth exploring also. Why is he crying when we meet him? And then something that comes up, number 3, something that comes up almost as a cliche now in the more contemporary, I don't want to say feminist necessarily. I think a humane, sort of logically consistent reading of the poem would elicit this conversation, which is to say that Penelope must remain faithful to her husband, even though he's been gone for 2 decades. Odysseus has sex over a 7-year period with this immortally beautiful goddess, and there doesn't seem to be any judgment of that fact. So I guess my question to my students often is, what do we think of this? Now, he leaves her willingly to return home to his wife, and that on the surface seems noble. But, for 7 years, he might be faithful in his mind, and he's faithful, crying his tears, but every night he sleeps with this goddess. Her name in Greek is from the word Calypso, which means to conceal, hide, cloak, or bury, which I find really interesting. So her very name suggests that she is keeping him from his destiny of returning home to his beloved wife Penelope. So I think this is worth thinking about. And I guess what I tell my students is, if you have an immediate strong reaction, so if your strong reaction is, this is incredibly inconsistent that Odysseus doesn't have to be faithful, but Penelope does, that's a legitimate reaction. Obviously, it's in the text. Imagine its opposite momentarily and see if that sheds any light on the character for you. Is there another way to look at this? Is he an utterly broken veteran healing the pain in any way possible, even in an immoral way, right? Is he under some spell? Like, does this god, is it really a choice? So there's lots of ways to look at this. 4, and I think this is really important. It's a really important detail that summaries of the chapters can't explain, is the epic similes, the long similes, that when Homer seems to want to pause his narrative and really shine a light on a feeling or on an image or on an event, he creates these epic similes. So when Odysseus leaves Calypso's island of Ogygia and he sees land for the first time on his trip, Homer stops the narrative and says, as when a father lies sick and weak for many days, tormented by some cruel spirit, till at last the gods restore him back to life, his children feel great joy. Odysseus felt that same joy when he saw land. So again, there's lots of ways to say a character feels joy, but it's really peculiar, and it's interesting that the way Odysseus feels joy is like a father come back to life, right? And we're almost getting little foreshadowings that the father will come back to life, maybe in new and exciting ways, in the last chunk of the poem. But when you are classic works, when you're tempted to skim a book like this, don't, right? This description that you could easily overlook, don't overlook it. Something that we discuss with book 6 is Odysseus lands on the Isle of the Phaeacians, and there's a whole chapter where Nausicaa, the princess, is doing her laundry with her friends and comes across Odysseus. And I think there's several things going on here. Again, it isn't to say that classics are perfect or great works of literature are perfect, but whenever we're tempted to sort of skim over a moment, pause and ask, well, why is this included? So here are some possibilities. First of all, Nausicaa is one of numerous examples of the virtue of xenia, or hospitality, or taking care of strangers. And it's easy to sort of theorize that xenia is the noble, pious thing to do. But these are teenage girls on a beach, and a large, muscular, also naked stranger sitting there in the bushes. And that the anxiety surrounding xenia is, if you didn't know who the strangers were that were at your doorstep, or in this case, at your beach, they could be men who were banished for committing terrible crimes. you weren't supposed to ask them their story until they were bathed and fed and rested. So there's a lot of anxiety. But this is just another in the tapestry of the poem, which, at least according to Emily Wilson, the sort of chorus, the main theme of the poem is this notion of Xenia. This is the latest example of it. Also, and I think this is easy to overlook, these are just teenage girls playing with a ball on the beach. So think of that. Think of Odysseus's time on the water. Think of Odysseus's time fighting, on or near beaches. That these innocent girls doing laundry and playing with the ball just represents everything that Odysseus isn't. He's a hardened, lost, sad, brilliant, adult, veteran man. And these are beautiful, innocent girls doing just common, boring, everyday chores. So, interacting with these girls being Odysseus would almost be like any of us walking on Mars right now. And then that great speech starting on line 144 is, Odysseus is throughout the poem is one wrong reference, one wrong communication away from being banished or executed. So he has to win over this girl. And what I appreciate is that she doesn't really succumb to flattery per se. That's not what makes her take care of him. She's kind of following the edicts of the gods, but she doesn't, just because he compares her to a goddess doesn't mean that she follows him and helps him get to her father, the king. But what we do see is his mastery of sort of different, awkward, difficult social situations. He's a naked man on a foreign beach talking to teenage girls, and he's able to get their help and protection and gain access to the king of the entire land. Sixth, I think this is pretty important, and we often don't get to all of this in class, which is why I do these little quick review presentations. I always ask my students, do you trust everyone in your life equally when they're talking? And I always joke with them, if I'm talking to you about books, that's the thing I know about, so I'm worth listening to, I think. But if I start talking to you about cars, you're not obligated to listen to me at all, because I don't know anything. It's witchcraft to me. So at this point, I think we know enough about Odysseus to know, like I said earlier, that when he's talking, he's often either lying outright or manipulating the truth of a story to fit his purposes in the moment. So he's at the island of the Phaeacians. It's this idyllic, beautiful place, and King Alcinous is wonderfully hospitable. And I want to point out that Odysseus begins to tell his version of the story here. For the next several chapters, we get the most famous moments in all of the Odyssey. But in this instance, I would like to say that Odysseus makes three key choices in his initial interaction with this new king. First, he doesn't tell any of the audience, and again, it's civilians because they didn't fight. This isn't an island of veterans. This is an island of sportsmen, which is different. He's not going to tell these people about the real experience of war. That's number one. Second, what's clear is that he's beginning to hint that something that means a lot to him is to correct this misunderstanding that many civilians have about veterans. And this comes sort of directly and indirectly out of Jonathan Shea's book, Odysseus in America, which you just should buy and read. It's amazing. And that a big focus of Odysseus here, because he's talking to people who haven't served, is to correct the misunderstanding that suffering ends when the war ends. Because we see Odysseus in a palace being treated like a prince, and he's in terrible pain, right? So he's in a way educating people who haven't served what service does to you psychologically. And I think lastly, he does promise to tell the king his full story. And these are the amazing adventure chapters that are often the focus of discussions on the Odyssey. So 7, another thing that's really, really important, it kind of connects to what I was just talking about. The court poet, the blind poet of the Phaeacians, Demodocus, sings three separate songs. He has like what I refer to as like a 3-song playlist. And what we see is the people in Alcinous's court who've read about war, who play sports, who are physically active, respond to stories as moving entertainment. But we see when the tale of Achilles and Odysseus' fight is told, or when the tale is told of the Trojan horse, Achilles is not listening to these stories as entertainment, but as really challenging emotional moments from his own life. And I'm just going to put this idea out there that I think what a lot of great books often do is they often contain the rules for reading them. In other words, I'm just thinking, I'm about to teach Frankenstein to my seniors. And I would argue that that book is largely about different ways of reading. I think the same of Pride and Prejudice, frankly. I think the same of Beowulf in terms of how stories move and are important, and definitely the case here. And I wonder, something just to think about is, how is this epic poem teaching us to read it? How are the stories within the poem instructive for us? Are we supposed to write thesis papers only? Are we supposed to make this solely an academic exercise? Are we supposed to memorize names and terms? Right? How can we read our lives into something that's 3,000 years old, set in ancient Greece? And how could I make this? How can I read this with both my mind and my heart? I think this can lead to some really good writing and conversations too. 8. And I love this little meme. I'm athletic. I play fantasy football. So kind of dovetailing off the last slide, Odysseus is in a land. Some of the young guys there are trash talkers, and he kind of wipes the floor with them throwing the discus and some other things. But clearly there's a difference between somebody on the fencing team and a warrior, right? Somebody on a football team and a Green Beret. And I think there's a difference here between the metaphorical war of sports versus actually, killing people in war. So again, to me, this is the Odyssey again, talking about what's real, what's real versus what's sort of an echo or a mirror or a metaphor of the real. 9th, and I think this is an important thing to maybe take some notes on or have a conversation about. In the last few chapters, we've met the hero of the book. And ask yourself, I'm not sure what you were expecting. I'm not sure if you were expecting something like out of an Avengers movie. If you come to this fresh, what are you expecting? You already know a little bit. So maybe have a conversation about what surprises you about Odysseus so far. What surprises you in terms of his military strength, his ability to weed a lot of difficult situations, his how sexually appealing he seems to be. The sort of contradictions and tensions within him are interesting. So maybe have a conversation about that. And this is one of my favorite Stephen Wright jokes. I almost had a psychic girlfriend, but she left me before we met. I love that. So I think now, 8 chapters in, I think we can ask some of these questions. Make some predictions. Have a conversation or journal about some predictions. What kind of stories will Odysseus tell the Phaeacians? It's Alcinous and his court. What kind of stories? We know that Odysseus was a family man in Ithaca. Is he going to tell those stories? Will he tell stories about the Trojan War, the 10 years he was fighting in Troy? Or will he tell us about the several years since then? Or will it be a combination? What do you think? Why do you think that? What do you think he's going to leave out? Will he tell them the truth? What does he get from telling these people the entire truth? And what do you think you're going to be surprised by? What would surprise you going forward? So these are some of the things I would think about. And I hope the first third of the epic has gone well for you. And I look forward to your thoughts. Feel free to post opinions on my page, and good luck with the book.